Hello, my name's John Armstrong. I'm a lecturer at National Formosa University in Taiwan. My topic in this presentation is Alienation, Disintegration and Narrative in Bao Nin's The Sorrow of War. Let me give you a quick outline of this presentation. Firstly, I just want to give a little bit of background as to why I'm discussing this very famous war novel. Then I want to move on to my first main point, and that is, can we look at Bao Nin's novel as a Gothic text? After that, I want to talk about the ideas of alienation and disintegration within the novel. And then finally, I want to stand back a little bit and ask some questions about war and narrative per se. So first, let's try to answer this question of why this novel. In my current research, I've become very interested in the relations between war and writing. And I'm particularly interested in modes of fiction which transcend realism. And most recently, novels which employ the Gothic mode when writing about war, or horror modes. In effect, employing a mode beyond realism to deal with the extremities of war. And this is how I'm looking at Bao Nin's novel, particularly for his use of ghosts and the Gothic mode, and how he creates what I call a haunted narrative. The first main part of my paper explores quite a simple question, and that is The Sorrow of War a Gothic text? So first let's just define what I mean when I say a Gothic text. Gothic is one of those words that has a long and complicated history, like romantic or postmodern, so it's worth being sure what it is I'm talking about when I say Gothic text. The critic and scholar Fred Botting says this. He says, Gothic texts are not rational, depicting disturbances of sanity and security, from superstitious belief in ghosts and demons, displays of uncontrolled passion, violent emotion or flights of fancy, to portrayals of perversion and obsession. He also says that Gothic texts register revulsion, abhorrence, fear, disgust and terror. Well, firstly, I would say that Bao Nin's novel The Sorrow of War contains all the elements of these definitions in abundance. This novel quite literally abounds with ghosts. It has the most graphic and horrific descriptions of bodies being blown apart and even vaporized. And there are stories of headless black soldiers, mythical jungle beasts, and an elusive forest man. So on a quite simple level, I would say the answer is yes, Bao Nin's novel is a Gothic text. However, we also need to take into consideration that it is an Asian text and, of course, a Vietnamese text. And we must remember also that the Gothic is primarily a European or Occidental conceit. In Vietnamese culture, there are different kinds of ghosts, and quite often some kinds of ghosts are treated in a very, perhaps what we'd call quotidian and rational way. Hionic Kwan says this, the spirits of the dead desire in the mind of the living food, money, clothing, shoes, sometimes a house and a bicycle or a Honda. This understanding of ghosts seems a long way from the Western conception, which is much more Gothic and fearful. Being aware of this traditional view of ghosts, of course, is important because it shows us how the Vietnamese see ghosts as still part of the community, with even some of the same needs as the community. Things like everyday things like food and money and clothing. Ghosts of ancestors or relatives, for example, ba ko, would be viewed like this. In a society then that sees ghosts as still part of the community, it's quite alarming to think of what the war in a country like that does. creating thousands upon thousands of ghosts in a short space of time. And in traditional Vietnamese culture, there is a different view for those ghosts who have been killed in untimely or violent deaths. The expression Chet Duing means quite literally death in the street, and this creates the kind of ghost which would be considered Linh Hong, or wandering soul. These ghosts are seen as much more marginal and unquiet. They are more likely to be feared, as they are angry at the violent death they have undergone. And they are trapped between this world and the next, and in some ways need to be laid to rest. This conception of the war dead, then, is much closer to perhaps the Western sort of Gothic tradition of, or more fearful view of ghosts. And it seems to me that operating within Bao Nin's text are both these ideas hand in hand. On the one hand, there is a candid acceptance of ghosts' existence, and on the other, a more Gothic conception of ghosts in which they are figures of horror. Close to the beginning of the novel, Kien, the main protagonist, is working for the remains collecting team just after the war, and he is having nightmares from sleeping so close to the dead bodies that they've found. His driver explains to him the problem. He says, "This is the jungle of screaming souls. It looks empty, but in fact it's crowded. There are so many ghosts and devils all over this battleground. Not a night goes by without them waking me up for a talk." This passage seems to me to capture perfectly both that Western Gothic and Vietnamese quotidian view of ghosts. We begin with very Gothic vocabulary, the jungle of screaming souls, ghosts and devils, but we end up with a very candid understanding of a ghost that might wake someone up for a little chat. So the more complex and interesting answer to the question, is The Sorrow of War a Gothic text, is still yes, but it contains also the more candid and quotidian view of ghosts that is common throughout Vietnamese superstition and tradition. Establishing Bao Nin's novel The Sorrow of War as a Gothic text, even with Asian differences, is all very well, but we need to ask why and to what end. Some of the keywords of this conference are individual and society, conflict, resolution, and synergy. And the Gothic mode and use of ghosts in terms of society and conflict creates what I would call disintegration and alienation. I split that first word up into two parts because I want to look at it in two different ways. Firstly, in its most common usage of things being blown apart, of which there are many examples in Bao Nin's text, but also of things coming apart, of things separating, and of conflict as a cause of alienation. Alienation of people from each other, and even alienation of people from themselves. This very simple diagram shows how ghosts, or the Gothic in the novel, inform these two different aspects of disintegration. Firstly, the novel contains a strong sense of physical disintegration. Bao Ninh does not shy away from showing the horror of modern technological warfare on the body. There are countless descriptions of the bodies being blown to pieces, obliterated, and even vaporized. But the novel also contains a sense of war's disintegration of the spirit. War does not only seem to make ghosts of the dead, but also ghosts of the living as well. In his later years, the main protagonist, Kien, is trying to come to terms with his trauma. Bao Ninh writes, He seemed to have inside of him a deep slash into which his life force was draining. And this is a kind of physical description of the psychic wounding of war, a physical description of the lasting trauma. To show how ghosts or the use of Gothic in the novel informs this idea of disintegration or alienation, I want to talk briefly about the story of Can. Can's desperate story sums up for me the extent to which war disintegrates and alienates people. Can deserts from his platoon because he feels alienated from his village of birth, and he is desperate to return to see his mother one last time. But instead he dies in the jungle to have his body pecked away by crows until he's just a skeleton. Because of his desertion, none of the men in the platoon will talk about him. So he kind of disappears in a lexical way as well. And finally he appears as a ghost in Kien's dreams. And he says to him, "My soul swims out of my corpse." Eventually then Can is disintegrated or alienated from everything. From his village, from his platoon and his colleagues, and even from himself. Violent death then, or the kind of undignified death that Can meets, signifies in the novel a kind of disintegration. But the writing of this kind of death is a kind of rebellion also. We must remember that Bao Ninh fought himself in the North Vietnamese army. And the main project of the war for the North Vietnamese, at least in terms of ideology, was one of reunification. And therefore this sense of disintegration within the novel is a subversion of that ideology.